for your patience as we waited for our attendees to arrive. My name is Aaron Sanderson, and I have the distinct pleasure of serving as one of the board members for Heritage Toronto. I've been a board member now for about 3.5 years and involved in many of the different programs. And I might be a little bit biased, but I think we're in store for a great presentation today from Chris, who I'll introduce to you in just a minute. I'll begin today's session by just having a couple announcements, just to help guide our conversation. We'll also make sure that we have some time to debrief with you, have some questions towards the end, where I'll make some additional announcements as well. We like to begin all of our sessions with a land acknowledgement. Heritage Toronto is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewas and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, Toronto is host to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Toronto is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which requires responsibility of all those who use the land to share it peaceably and care for it. Heritage Toronto acknowledges this responsibility and recognizes the efforts of these nations in maintaining the land. Founded in 1949, we acknowledge that Heritage Toronto has contributed to the colonial historical narrative. We're working very hard to amend that by engaging with Indigenous communities to incorporate more of their stories into our programming. Plaques with colonial language are being revised. Indigenous content is being integrated into our walking tours, and in the future, we hope to expand our Indigenous programming. Heritage Toronto is a charity and agency of the City of Toronto that celebrates our city's rich heritage and the diverse stories of its people, places, and its events. Through our programs, including tours like this, our plaques, the State of Heritage Report, and online exhibits, we engage the public to reflect on the past, both to make sense of our present and to inform our future. And I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to thank our 2021 tours presenting sponsor, which is TD and the TD Ready Commitment. And truthfully, without their support, these tours would not be possible. And we're so grateful for TD returning back once again to help present our tour programs this year. So I'd like to also begin with a reminder that if you have any questions during the tour, what we're going to do is we're going to collect those throughout and spend some time at the end to address them. So if you could enter them using the Q&A button that's just at the bottom of your screen, we'll go through those together at the end and make sure that we get some great answers to your questions. And we've got an awesome expert with us to do that. So without further ado, because you did not come to hear me present, I would like to introduce to you your tour leader today, which is Chris Bateman. Chris is the plaques manager at Heritage Toronto and a freelance writer who specializes in Toronto's history. He co-developed this tour and the plaques and the digital tour. So if you've had a chance to experience some of the plaques along this particular route, that's some of Chris's handiwork. So again, without further ado, I'll turn things over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaron, and welcome everybody to this Zoom presentation of Made in Toronto, Leslieville's industrial history. As Aaron said, I'm Chris Bateman. I'm the manager of the Plaques program at Heritage Toronto, and I hope you're all staying indoors as this evening gets stormy. I'm hoping that the thunder and lightning will quieten down while I'm giving this presentation, but you may still hear some rumblings from the sky outside. So just a little bit of backstory on this project. Made in Toronto was the culmination of 2 years of deep research and interpretive work on the former industrial area between Queen and Gerrard on Carlaw Avenue in Toronto's East End. The project itself was funded by community benefit money secured by Councillor Paula Fletcher, and we rolled out the project in 3 phases. The first phase, as Aaron mentioned, was to produce historical plaques. So Many of the former factory buildings in the Dundas and Carlow area were plaqued in 2018. We followed that up with a printed self-guided tour in 2019, and we also then launched a digital version of this tour, which pulls together content from the plaques along with additional images and research. And we were especially honored in 2020 when Made in Toronto won a Lieutenant Governor's Ontario Heritage Award. So it's an award-winning tour as well. So why did we decide to focus on these factories? Well, we wanted to underscore the fact that Toronto's heritage is everywhere, often hiding in plain sight, and that heritage is often very active and busy. Heritage in Toronto isn't all Victorian houses, I promise. The factories where people worked are also really important to Toronto's built heritage. And it was important for us to tell a new kind of story, the story of people who worked and lived and played in this neighborhood. Just to situate us mentally here, we're going to be exploring the former industrial area on Carlow Avenue, which is in the east end of Toronto. And those of you who are not from the city, this stylish map should give you a rough sense of the area we're talking about. It's the area marked in orange on the map. Those of you who are not from Toronto but ride the GO train or take the Via line into the city, many of you will have passed Dundas and Carlow and the factories as you approach Union Station out the window as well. Normally we'd be walking through this area, but for this presentation we've decided to sort of dispense with the geography a little bit and focus on some of the buildings. So before the factories, there was an Indigenous presence here, as we heard in the land acknowledgement. There were marshes to the south of the Dundas and Carlow industrial area, which Indigenous people used for hunting, fishing, rest, and relaxation. And there's an entry in the diary of Elizabeth Simcoe, and Elizabeth Simcoe was the wife of the founder of Toronto, John Graves Simcoe, and she wrote in her diary, and I'm going to read a little excerpt from it here. I rode on the peninsula from 1 till 4. I saw loons swimming on the lake. They make a noise like a man hollowing in a tone of distress. The air on these sands is particularly clear and fine. The Indians esteem this place so healthy that they come and stay here when they are ill. The soil around Carlow Avenue was particularly rich as well. And many market gardens were built in this area, and those were some of the first colonial uses of the land in the east end of Toronto. Market gardens were used for growing flowers and fruit and vegetables, which would then be sold in markets around the city. And Leslieville, the surrounding area, the neighbourhood that Dundas and Carlow is within, is named for George Leslie, who had extensive flower nurseries here. And they were at one time advertised as the largest in the British Empire. The clay-rich soil also allowed for brick making. This is generally east of the area that we're going to be exploring today, around Greenwood Avenue. But it's not an exaggeration to really say that this area contributed to feeding and building Toronto. One of the first major changes that led to Carlow Avenue becoming industrial was the construction of the Grand Trunk Railway through the east end of Toronto in 1856. The GTR linked Toronto with the Port of Montreal, and then the Port of Montreal was connected to the Atlantic trade routes, which really opened up this area and opened up Toronto to an international market. You can see the railway here on this map. It's the line that is running from the bottom left corner all the way up to the top right. One of the other major changes was actually something of an accident. In 1906, the city seized a substantial portion of land along Carlow Avenue from its owner because of tax arrears. They seized it in payment of taxes. And rather than open that land up for housing, like the surrounding area, they decided to zone this area as industrial because it was so close to the Grand Trunk Railway. American Chickel was one of the first major factories to be built at Logan and Dickens Street in 1906, and that is the factory you can see on the left here. If you have very good vision, you'll be able to read the paint on the outside of that building, which is advertising chiclets, which is the product that American Chickel made. Initially, the brand was later sold off and other companies made chiclets, but around the time the factory was built, that was their main product. Unfortunately, this factory has now gone and the lot is vacant. The Grand Trunk Railway also installed freight tracks to the rear of many of the future factory sites in 1907, and actually a small building boom began. Unfortunately, not all factories were welcome. The local neighborhood actually fought and won against a plan to build a tannery on Carlaw Avenue. Leather tanneries, if you know anything about the process of leather making, are particularly smelly, and they're usually placed on the outskirts of cities for that reason. So there's a little bit of NIMBY history here, because the local neighbors, well, quite rightly actually, were concerned about, first of all, the smell, but also the impact on their property values. So all these, we've got the ground being laid here. We've got the Grand Trunk Railway, and we've got these sites which are zoned for factories. The sort of the final step in developing Dundas Carlaw into an industrial area was the laying down of city services. So things like electricity and sewage had to go in. And one of the most conspicuous pieces of infrastructure was a large electrical substation, which was built in 1916, and that actually stands still and remains a piece of active electrical infrastructure. That's it pictured on the right there. That's located on Carlaw Avenue. And you can see just down on street level, there's actually a little storefront there. And for many years, this building, when electricity was still a novelty, had a store inside where you could buy electric appliances like a toaster or an iron directly from the electrical company. So one of the first factories we're going to really focus on as part of this tour is the Colgate Palmolive plant that was located at the corner of Carlaw and Natalie Street. It was built in 1918 for the B.J. Johnson Company originally. It was designed by the architecture firm Prack and Perrine, and they are the same architects that designed the Wrigley factory, which we'll be seeing a bit later on this tour. The original building was just 2 stories, but it was later expanded to have 6 floors and sort of slowly sort of evolved and expanded to take up the entire property. And you can see here this picture from July 1986 showing the Colgate Palmolive at its greatest extent in its history. The B.J. Johnson Company's most popular product was a soap made from palm and olive oil called Palmolive. It was marketed as containing the same ingredients used by the ancient Greeks for cleaning. Palmolive soap was actually so popular that the company was later renamed after it. And in 1928, Palmolive merged with Colgate, and Natalie Street, the street that ran outside the factory, was renamed Colgate Avenue in 1949, and the street still has that name. The main Colgate Palmolive plant, they made Palmolive body soap, Palmolive dish soap, shaving products, Colgate toothpaste, and cleaning products like Ajax, ABC, Arctic laundry detergent. But the process of making soap was notoriously smelly, so you avoid a tannery, you get a soap factory. And neighbors often complained and were certainly aware of the smell and noxious odors coming from the chimneys of the Colgate Palmolive factory. There were actually 10 massive kettles within the factory basement during its early years that boiled fat and oil and soda ash to create the base ingredients for making soap. The Colgate Palmolive plant was a major employer in the Dundas and Carlaw neighborhood until it closed in the early 1990s. and that closure cost 240 people their job when the factory finally closed down, and the building itself was demolished completely in 1995. And the lot itself sat vacant for a number of years, about a decade, until it was redeveloped into a condominium around 2010. And that's a trend that we will see a few times as we progress along here and explore some of the other factories. And despite starting this tour with two factories that have been demolished, that actually isn't really a trend that we're going to see for the rest of the tour either. We're lucky that many of the factories are still standing and still used. So we're now going to virtually, mentally cross Carlaw Avenue over to the Rolfe Clark Stone plant. Rolfe Clark Stone was a lithography company, and they opened this factory in 1913, which makes it one of the older surviving factories in this neighborhood. Rolfe Clark Stone was one of the largest graphic arts companies in Canada during the 20th century. And when the factory here opened on Carlaw Avenue, the company employed nearly 400 people. As you can see in that picture on the right, there's actually a very faded painted sign over the door, which what we call a ghost sign, carrying the Rolfe Clark Stone name above the main entrance. The building itself, and it's not pictured here, unfortunately. Actually, yes, it is on the left side, the old advertisement there. The building had something called a sawtooth roof, which allowed natural light to penetrate deep within the building. It's a very large structure, and in order to fully light it, they had this sawtooth shaped roof that really benefited the artists working inside. Rolfe Clark Stone became more like a modern graphic design firm in the 1950s and 60s. And that was under the guidance of their influential art director, Claire Stewart. He expanded the design department, and the company started to do design and graphic design work for Canada Packers, Canada Steamship Lines, the CNE, the Ontario government, and the Toronto Star. You start to see that sort of Mad Men world emerge once they transition from purely a printing and lithography type business. After leaving Rolfe Clark Stone, Claire Stewart formed his own company that developed some really famous logos, iconic Canadian logos, including the Bank of Montreal logo, the TD logo, sponsor of this tour, Scotiabank, Seagram's Distillery, even the Montreal Expos, and the CTV logo and branding as well. And of course, many of these are actually still in use. So those logos designed certainly had longevity. Claire Stewart himself, after his time at Rolfe Clark Stone, has an interesting connection to Toronto transit history. He was a consultant on the graphic design of the Toronto subway in the 1950s. The TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, when it was building Canada's first subway, really put a lot of thought into the appearance and the physical design of their stations and trains, but also the sort of the identity of the TTC at the time. And they created a brand new logo, which is one that is still in use today. And they also designed a very unique typeface, font typeface, that was used on their signage, but also on the platforms as well, to indicate the names of the station. Claire Stewart didn't design these himself, but he was certainly involved in that process and helped sort of shape the current identity that the TTC still has today. In 1950, Rolfe Clark Stone built a major expansion to its factory. And in addition to adding extra workspace, the extension also included a cafeteria and a doctor's office. And like many companies in the Dundas and Carlaw area, Rolfe Clark Stone took a really keen interest in their employees' well-being. They organized social clubs and after-work events, and even through the doctor's office chipped in with healthcare. Dundas and Carlaw factories regularly competed against each other in various sports. So there were local factory baseball leagues, softball leagues, bowling, golf, basketball, you name it. And the picture you can see here in the upper left shows the Rolf Clark Stone softball team in the 1950s. And if you have especially strong eyes, the men wearing the white jackets have a very neat little Rolf Clark Stone insignia on the outside of their jacket. It's pretty cool. The company newsletter also extensively covered all of their social life, and its copies of that have been digitized by the Leslieville Historical Society, and it makes for fascinating reading. There was an ulterior motive, a little bit around the organizing sports leagues with these teams. Social clubs and sports teams were a way for businesses like Rolf Clark Stone to build loyalty and retain staff long term. You know, you see that with tech companies today. They believed blending work and play increased productivity, but it also reduced the chances of workers becoming unhappy and potentially leaving to find work elsewhere. You know, when your work life and your social life are tied together, it makes you less likely or more likely to think twice about looking for a new job, perhaps. That approach didn't always work. In July 1949, about 1,000 union members of the Amalgamated Lithographic Workers of America were involved in a major labor dispute with their employers in Quebec and Ontario, and that included Rolf Clark Stone. The union, their demands were a 10-cent wage increase to the hourly wage, which would be about a wage increase of $1.10 today. They wanted a reduction in working hours from 40 to 37.5 each week, a company pension, and a benefits plan. And we spoke with Lulu Ciani for this project, and he was one of those people who was on strike at Rolf Clark Stone for almost 6 months. His picture is actually up in the corner here, and the protesters and their signs are standing outside the Rolf Clark Stone factory on Carlaw Avenue. The strike was eventually resolved, and the workers got what they wanted. But interestingly, only the male employees got what they wanted. Female workers were assumed to be dependent on the heads of the household and not necessarily the breadwinners, so they were exempt from this change. After Rolf Clark Stone moved to the suburbs, the factory itself, parts of the factory itself, I should say, became used by the fashion company Dilex. And at the time, Dilex owned and operated the brands Harry Rosen. They owned the brand and ran the brand Tip Top Tailors, which has a long Toronto history, Club Monaco, Byway, and many others. In 2010, the Rolf Clark Stone building, the original building, and also the factory extension were converted for residential use, and they're now known as the Printing and Garment Factory Lofts, which is a nod to the previous usage. So just a little further north on Carlaw Avenue, as we continue this mental walking tour of Dundas and Carlaw, is the Reliable Toy Factory. At Reliable Toy and factories throughout Toronto, men and women work together, but in different jobs. Men often worked with heavy machinery on the production line, or they were foremen, managers, engineers, while women worked in administration or packaging or on the product lines where very precise work was needed. And many of the companies believed that women were more suitable for these roles because they could do finer work with their hands. Until relatively recently, some factories would only employ single women because once again, after marriage, women were culturally expected to work in the home and raise children. There's a quote here on the screen from Yvonne Nearing, someone we interviewed as part of the Dundas and Carlaw research process. Her sister met her husband while working at Reliable Toy, but once they were married, she could no longer work at the company. And as the culture dictated at the time, she was the one to leave her job, and her solution was to simply walk across the street and get a job at Rolfe Clark Stone, which did hire married women. And a reliable toy, women were really in these sort of highly specialized roles. So they were hair makers, they were doll face painters, and people who made squeakers and voice boxes for dolls. During the Second World War, Reliable Toy went through a really substantial change to their output. So shifting away from toys, they essentially became a company that was primarily supporting the war effort. The plant made plastic bullet tips, bayonet covers, oil containers, various plastic products for use in the armed forces. And at this time, incidentally, many more women entered the workforce in place of men who were serving overseas. And many of those women then lost their jobs when the men returned from active combat. Interestingly, because Reliable Toy decided to take this this new line and start developing plastic products, it gave them a fantastic edge over their competitors once the war was over. And they actually produced some of the very first plastic toys in Canada, which incidentally included little plastic soldiers. And some of those very soldiers were actually made from melted military surplus materials. So kids buying plastic soldiers from Reliable Toy in the late 1940s could actually have been buying plastic that had once been a bullet tip or something actually used by the military. So a little bit of backstory on Reliable Toy itself. The company was founded in the 1920s by two brothers, Alex and Solomon Frank Samuels. And the company had several factories around the city before they settled on Carlo Avenue in 1935. At its peak, during the 40s and 50s, Reliable Toy made just about every part of the doll here on Carlo Avenue. I mentioned some of those specialized roles earlier. In the 50s, they were especially known because they also produced some of the hottest toys for kids at Christmas in Canada. One of them being the Carrie doll and the other being the Barbara Ann Scott doll, who is, you can see in the center advertisement here. The Barbara Ann Scott doll, of course, being modeled on the figure skater, who was very famous at the time. One of the dolls you can see here is called Topsy on the far right. And this was one of many black dolls that Reliable Toy made for sale overseas. It's interesting, when we were looking through many of the company's catalogs from the 50s, you noticed that the features of the black dolls that they produced for the Canadian market were would often use racially insensitive physical exaggerations, while the dolls that Reliable made for export were more realistic. And we figured that perhaps the Topsy name for this doll may have come from a type of half black, half white cloth toy that originated on plantations in the American South. In the lead up to Christmas in 1954, Reliable Toy was profiled by CBC News. The video documented many of the various roles involved in making a doll. And I'm going to play this video for you now. It is subtitled, so you'll be able to get a sense of the sound.
To look behind the scenes at a varied scene, typical of many Canadian industries, for enterprise, ingenuity, and struggle against difficult odds. This firm turns out close to $500,000 a year. It's unique practically the world over because it makes every one of the dozens of components assembled by expert fingers. "800 employees, mostly women, many of them immigrants, work here. The firm operates on a profit-sharing basis. Employees benefit in time of prosperity, even down to the bench hands, who give stylish hairdos to hundreds of dolls better than natural hair. Most toy firms operate strictly for the home market, but this doll's destination may be Venezuela, or the Belgian Congo, Lebanon, or Singapore. 35 years in the toy business is a long record for a Canadian firm. And here, expert methods and marketing prove that Canada can compete in a highly competitive field.
I don't know about you, but I always get some sort of some slight chills watching them drill the hair into the head of these dolls and sort of push in the eyeballs. But that was a really neat piece of video that we uncovered during the research into Reliable Toy.
To look behind the scenes.
It wasn't all work on the factories on Carlisle Avenue. As I sort of mentioned earlier, many of the workplaces had a rich social life that was really encouraged by those paternalistic company owners. In addition to sports and things like that, Christmas parties were a huge deal for factories on Carlisle Avenue. The Samuels family, who owned Reliable Toy, were famous for their Christmas parties. Even though they were Jewish. There's a quote on the screen there describing that. And the Wrigleys Gum Company as well, which we were about to get to, held parties for the children of its workers. And you can see on screen there some kids really enjoying some fantastic accordion music at a Christmas party in the 1950s. So we're going to, once again, virtually cross the street here to one of the most architecturally impressive buildings on Carlisle Avenue, the Wrigleys Chewing Gum Factory. The world famous Wrigleys Gum Company built this factory in 1915. The architects Prack and Perrine, who built the Colgate Palmolive plant, styled this factory after the main Wrigley factory in Chicago. At the time it was built, this was one of the tallest buildings, certainly in the East End, but definitely in the Dundas and Carlisle area. Workers within this factory made the famous double mint, spearmint, you can see on your screen there, and juicy fruit chewing gum as well. They also made a gum called PK, which unfortunately didn't really survive as a product long term. The raw materials for chewing gum, so Chickel, sugar, and essential oils, were processed inside of this factory into sheets, not that all sort of tablet type chewing gum you get today, into large sheets. They were then packaged and then shipped out and distributed across Canada. Remember, this factory, and like many others, had a direct rail connection at the rear. The factory had to be technologically advanced, and they had a special cooling system within to make sure that the factory was kept at a constant temperature that prevented the gum becoming too sticky during the manufacturing process. Some of that new technology that was employed here was that wrapping of the gum in wax paper, and that stopped it drying out and losing its flavor. Another interesting aspect to life, another unexpected aspect to life in the Wrigley factory that we learned about through researching this tour was actually in the air that you breathe inside of the building. To make spearmint and double mint, the company used very pungent and minty essential oils. So apparently it made the air sort of like inhaling Vicks or something. You know, it would clear out your sinuses when you walked onto the factory floor. And in addition to that, the company also ground sugar into a very fine powder for adding into the chewing gum. And the result of that was often that the air tasted very sweet. And we spoke to a woman, Denise White, who worked in the Wrigley Chewing Gum Factory in the 1950s during the summers. And she told us that some of herself and some of her colleagues even got sort of cavities in their mouth as a side effect of working in the Wrigley plant because of that airborne sugar. We were in touch with Wrigley as part of this process, and they were incredibly helpful in providing us with access to some of their archival material. We reached out to them initially, and they sent us essentially a hard drive of incredible images. And one of the real gems that they sent us was actually a video that was made in 1915, showing some of the manufacturing process inside the factory. I'm just going to show a quick excerpt from that here, just showing some of the sheets of gum coming off the production line and then being stacked ready for cutting. But the original video is much longer, and I encourage you to go to the Dundas and Carlaw project, the Made in Toronto project website after this to see the full thing, because it's really interesting. But I'll just hit play here and let you see that gum coming off the production line. It's a silent video, by the way. This video predates any kind of sound. So Wrigley was very ahead of its time and a very creative marketing company during its time in Canada. The founder of the company, William Wrigley, owned the Chicago Cubs baseball team, and many of you will know, if you follow baseball, that the Chicago Cubs stadium is still called Wrigley Field after him and after his company. It wasn't until many decades later, of course, that the naming rights for sports stadiums became commonplace. So, you know, we have the Scotiabank Arena and the Rogers Centre now. Wrigley Field was that of its day. In Toronto, the company sponsored sporting events and raised its profile during the wars and between the wars with neon signs located around the city. And you saw that in one of the earlier slides. Wrigley's marketing skill was actually so strong that even a major setback could be parlayed into an opportunity. So during the Second World War, there were shortages of many of the natural ingredients that Wrigley needed in its chewing gum manufacturing process. And because of this, Wrigley made a very interesting decision. They decided, instead of trying to get the limited quantities of spearmint and double mint onto the shelves, they would send that chewing gum overseas to soldiers fighting on the front lines. This was a savvy move because, first of all, it created brand loyalty, because it gave people a way to support the soldiers and that sort of a thing. It also built brand loyalty. So for the soldiers who were fighting and receiving this gum as part of their rations, the cigarette companies did similar things as well. They were keen to have their products put in ration packs so that when those soldiers returned, there was already that sort of brand loyalty, and hopefully they would continue chewing Wrigley's gum and smoking whatever brand of cigarettes they received in their ration pack. While it was sending its products overseas, in Canada, the company developed a replacement gum called Orbit, which didn't use Chickel and used some of the ingredients that were available. You can see an advert for it there on the top left on your screen. As you can see, it's not exactly the most emphatic of adverts. It says that it's made of pure, wholesome, available ingredients. So that Orbit was short-lived, although incidentally it does, as a Brit, I know this, it does live on in the UK as an active chewing gum brand. While it was sending its gum overseas, the company Wrigley started a ad campaign called Remember This Wrapper or Remember This Package. And that was essentially urging customers not to forget while they were buying Orbit gum, not to forget about spearmint, not to forget about double mint, because they didn't want that to backfire. They wanted people to remember it when it eventually did come back to the shelves. And you can see that Remember This Package advert there in the bottom left. The original Wrigley factory was expanded after it was first built, and there is now a second wing to the south, built in an identical architectural style. So for those of you who know Carlo Avenue and know the Wrigley factory, you will note that from the pictures you saw earlier, it's since doubled in size, and they're a matching pair. Wrigley itself stayed on Carlo Avenue until the 1960s, and then moved to a new facility in the suburbs in Don Mills, and they continued making chewing gum there until 2016, and then unfortunately closed their Canadian operation entirely. And you'll see that is also a trend that we will see as we continue on here. So probably the most famous and easy to spot factory in the Dundas and Carlo area is the Woods factory. Those of you who know the neighbourhood or who have come in on the railway line or driven along Dundas Street, but will know that building because of its large painted sign that still marks the company's historic water tower. The Woods Manufacturing Company building was one of the first to be built in the neighborhood. It dates back to 1907, just after the American Chickel Company, and also right across the street from the American Chickel Company, incidentally. Before the company became known for its outdoor gear, and I suspect many of you here will recognize the Woods brand, or maybe have some Woods brand outdoor gear in your homes. Before that, it was initially known as a manufacturer of fiber products and things like sacks, fiber sacks, jute fiber sacks that were used in shipping. So shipping grain across the country on the railway. Those sacks were made by Woods. The company itself had factories around the country as well, in Montreal, Toronto, obviously, Ottawa, Winnipeg, and Welland. And during the mid-1900s, the company's reputation for outdoor products like tents, you can see the advert here on your screen, really became the company's main focus. They even made outdoor camping pajamas, which they called sleeping robes, which I think is quite neat. During the World Wars, Woods, like Reliable Toy and like Wrigley, also contributed to the fighting effort. They produced hammocks, tents, summer uniforms, and gas mask covers for the Canadian military. And one thing people may not know about Woods is that the company outfitted the first Canadians to reach the summit of Mount Everest. So wearing Woods insulated jackets, Laurie Skreslet of Calgary and Sherpas Sungdair and Lakpa Dorje were the first to summit Everest and to reach the top. Tragically, 4 members of the expedition died in an avalanche and in an icefall before reaching the peak. In total, 20 Canadians and 39 Nepalese Sherpas took part in the Everest 82 climb, which was sponsored by 98 companies in total, including Air Canada and including Woods. Woods provided the jackets that you can see here on screen, parkas, for the expedition. They also made special tents pictured on the right that were made of bulletproof nylon. They claimed it was bulletproof. I doubt it really was, but they called it bulletproof nylon to help withstand the intense conditions the climbers were expected to face on Everest, the high winds. Woods has since moved on, but as I mentioned before, the factory really remains a neighborhood landmark. It's been remodeled and expanded considerably, and the building now houses multiple commercial enterprises. There's a clothing company in there, a sculpture school, dance studio, 3D printing workshop, you name it. It's broken up into lots of smaller workshop type spaces. The Canadian Tire is the company that now continues the Woods legacy. They own the brand. If you've been into Canadian Tire recently, as I have, you will see that the Woods branded products are back on the shelf once again. And this is a great picture as well, because you can see that sign that I referred to earlier, that ghost sign, which is painted on the water tower. Within that space, although it's bricked in now, was the company's private water tower, which pressurized the building. So the rail network that dominated the Dundas and Carlaw area really supported the factories. It made industry in the area attractive, but it was also one of the reasons why the neighborhood factories began to decline. In the 1960s, trucking became cheaper and more convenient compared to rail, and many of the businesses and factories located on Carlaw Avenue moved to newer factories that could accommodate trucks in the suburbs. But not all the trains are gone. The former GTR railway that we saw on the map at the start of the tour is still used by passenger trains. GO Transit, Lakeshore East Line uses that track, as does the Via Rail trains on the Quebec City-Windsor route, and also in the coming years, so too will subway trains on the new Ontario Line subway. The freight tracks that came off of the GTR main line and fed the factories, often going directly to the rear of the factories, are mostly gone now, but not entirely. If you are in Toronto and are inclined, you can explore the neighborhood, and if you go to the intersection of Dickens and Thackeray at the rear of the Woods building, you can actually still see some of those rails. They're still in the ground, poking up through the tarmac, and there's even a old railway crossing sign that still survives out there. And actually, one of my favorite railway relics in this neighborhood is actually in this image on the right, and you won't see any actual railway tracks there. But these condo buildings at the southeast corner of Dundas and Carlaw have a very distinctive space between them, a curved space. And this is actually the former route of one of the railway freight lines that came off of the GTR tracks down the back to the Wrigley factory. And these buildings that are standing today, they reflect that shape still because of complicated reasons, but put simply, the former track right-of-way is property owned by a company separate to the condo buildings on the north and south. So when they were developed, that former railway track space was not and was retained, and it reflects itself in the architecture of these buildings, despite never having been there when the buildings were built. One of the terms that has been coined for this type of phenomenon is scarchitecture, where historical infrastructure is reflected in the modern streetscape in some unusual way. And this is certainly a great example of that. Before the 1950s, the intersection of Dundas and Carlaw, which is the sort of nexus for this tour, that intersection didn't exist at all because Dundas Street hadn't been built yet. The street was extended through here to ease rush hour traffic in and out of Toronto's downtown, starting in the 1950s. And actually, as part of this process, the Woods factory was completely split in half in 1954. So there is a building on the south side of Dundas Street now. It contains a large mural, which is quite distinctive. That building used to be connected to Dundas Street, connected to Woods on the north side. The factory itself lay directly in the proposed path of Dundas Street. And so the solution was to simply knock right through, to build the street through the Woods factory. And so today you have the main portion of Woods on one side and this little relic of the Woods factory on the south side. It's really neat if you get a chance to go out there. It's one of those pieces of history that really do hide in plain sight, because it's not immediately obvious that those two buildings were ever connected. But if you get a chance, you can see the connection in the brickwork, for example, matches on both sides of the street. So today, when you're driving on Dundas Street or cycling on Dundas Street, you are actually passing through the Woods factory, or passing through the former site of the Woods factory. As we've all heard at this point, Dundas Street itself is going to be renamed following a public consultation process over the next year. And in fact, Dundas actually has a very long history of being renamed and realigned. Some of the oldest portion of Dundas Street in Toronto was originally only west of today's Ossington Avenue in the West End. The Dundas Street between Ossington and Broadview Avenue, so through Toronto's downtown core, was created by merging together several smaller streets and widening them out to form a new crosstown route. And those of you who have traveled Dundas Street will perhaps be familiar with how it weaves and jogs as it goes through downtown. It never seems to sort of continue on one straight route like many of Toronto's streets do on this grid pattern. It has all these sort of jerks and moves in it. And if you're on the Dundas streetcar, you notice that especially. That is a relic of the street absorbing smaller roads through the downtown core. And east of Broadview Avenue, so through the Dundas and Carlaw area, the same thing happened. In the 1950s, Dundas was extended, and once again, it absorbed many of those smaller streets which lost their names. They were renamed Dundas as part of that. So some of the streets that Dundas has absorbed and renamed over the years include Arthur Street, St. Patrick Street, Anderson Street, Agnes Street, Wilton Avenue, Dagmar, Dole, Apple Grove, Ashbridge Avenue. All of these streets were originally separate and distinct, and are now part of Dundas, which itself will be renamed. So there's a bit of a historical precedent almost for renaming Dundas Street, and we at Heritage Toronto will be following closely the public consultation process, and we will also be updating this tour and following the selection of a new name when it is finally decided next year, I believe. So the last major factory on our tour today really dominates the west side of Carlaw Avenue, north of Dundas Street. This giant factory complex was built in 1912 for the Jefferson Glass Company. This company made blown and pressed glass, light bulbs, light shades, and illuminated signs. And at its peak, it turned out about 35,000 light bulbs a day from its factory on Carlaw Avenue. One of their other major products, and you can see an advert for it there on your screen, was glass shades for street lighting. And Jefferson actually sold these light standards and light shades to cities like Toronto and Montreal. And you can see them in some of the historical street photos at the time, these wonderful glass globe shades. And continuing the trend that we've established through this tour, Jefferson also made glass products for the military during the First World War. Jefferson left Carlaw Avenue and left its factory in 1931, and the factory became a box factory operated by ACME Paper Box. ACME essentially added various new buildings to the Jefferson complex, and it has resulted in what you see here in this photo from the 80s, which is essentially a a big mishmash architecturally. There's extensions here and there and bits and pieces added on. It's not really one cohesive structure anymore. It's actually sort of a patchwork of various buildings that were put together over the years. I mentioned that the company's name was ACME, and when I said that, I imagine many of you immediately thought of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. At the time that cartoon was made, ACME was actually a really common company name. It literally means the highest point, and companies used it to signify that they were the best, you know, the peak, the zenith of whatever they were making or doing. Unfortunately for the ACME businesses everywhere, including ACME Paper Box, the dubious quality of the products supplied by the ACME Corporation to Wile E. Coyote somewhat spoiled the word and the company name. So you don't find too many companies these days that have either kept their ACME name or decided to use it as a new company name anymore. ACME Paper Box on Carlaw Avenue was a family business until the 1960s, when it was sold to a large conglomerate, and the plant here, actually at the time this photo was taken, was a paper mill that operated into the late 1980s. So as you have heard during this tour, many of the factories began to close and relocate between the 1960s and the 1980s. Many moved to new factories in the suburbs that were larger and could accommodate the latest production line technology. And the factories on Carlaw Avenue gradually became empty and fell into disuse, and many of them had times at least when they were completely derelict. The big change for this area came starting in the 1990s, when several very savvy property developers saw the opportunity to convert these dormant factories into smaller workshops, break up the space and turn them into studios, turn them into small workshops and factories, turn them into residential lofts. One of the first buildings for this to undergo that type of change was the Crown, Cork and Seal building. And this is one we didn't focus on today, but it's at the southwest corner of Dundas and Carlaw, and that company made Crown Corks, which some of you will know is the old name for a bottle cap. And they also made metal cans and aerosols. In 1996, Guyan Jain, who is an engineer who migrated from India to Canada in the 1960s, he bought the Crown, Cork and Seal building and installed many of those small units that were affordable to photographers and artists and entrepreneurs, people looking for a small, affordable space to get their business off the ground. And in 2008, actually, the Jain family also bought and converted part of the former Rolf Clark Stone plant and turned that into residential lofts. They were responsible for that project too. And today, as you can see from this before and after photo, the area is really dominated by buildings that have either been fully converted to residential use or buildings that have that sort of live-work mix. The Wrigley building, for example, has a mix of live-work spaces. Rolf Clark Stone is primarily residential, but the Woods building, as I mentioned, and the Reliable Toy building are still primarily working spaces. There's hundreds of businesses operating inside those buildings today. One of the big changes that is still to come for Dundas and Carlaw that we have not seen yet is the construction of the Ontario Line subway that will pass under this area. And there is a station planned at the north end of this area at Carlaw and Gerrard Street. So over the last 150 years, this area has really transitioned from agricultural to heavily industrial, and now to a mix live and work. And it's a fascinating area that I encourage you all to explore on your own time, and hopefully explore on your own time with the Made in Toronto website open on your phone or on your device. It's responsive to whatever technology you're on. If you can't make it to the area, we designed the tour to work just as well from home as well. There's many photos and pictures and other multimedia assets that I couldn't get into the tour, unfortunately, today. So I really encourage you to check that out. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Carlo Avenue and the factories, and I'm now going to turn it back over to Aaron, and we'll have a short Q&A. Thank you very much.
Fantastic presentation, Chris. I think we all can say that we learned some more about this particular neighborhood, and thanks also for suggesting the digital tour. I know that I've pulled that open a few times to share with some friends when we were in the neighborhood. So we'll take a little bit of time right now to do some question and answer with Chris. I will warn us sort of when we're nearing the end of our time for questions. I know we already have some, Chris, in the Q&A, so you can take a look there and we'll go through some of those. So if you do have a question now, best thing for you to do is to go down to the bottom of your screen and enter your question in the text box there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'll turn it back over to you, Chris, and then I'll finish things up with some closing thoughts.
Thanks. Actually, I'm clicking the Q&A button here, but I can't actually get the questions to appear. Or maybe it's because I'm sharing my screen. Actually, I'm going to stop. Here we go. Found them. It was I still had my presentation up, so I couldn't see the questions here. We've got a question from Paul, who asks, "Is it true that dialects stood for damn your lousy excuses?" That sounds very familiar, and I will say it's been a couple of years since I was really that deep into the research, but I want to say that rings true. I can't answer that question for certain, but I'm going to go plausible on that question. Paul has another question here. I wonder whether the children knew about the source of their plastic toys. It'd be interesting to advertise the links in these days. That's an interesting comment, Paul. I doubt that Reliable Toy really advertised the origin of their plastic. It's a neat thing for us to know, I think, after the fact. But I think if the kids had known or the parents rather had known their toys were made from military surplus, maybe they wouldn't have bought them as much as they did. Deborah asks, what were the pure wholesome ingredients in the Orbit chewing gum that I mentioned earlier? Good question. I don't have the answer to that to hand. I know that the key ingredient that was missing was Chickel, which was grown is a natural product that was grown in South America. And as you can imagine, as the Second World War really increased and shipping became more difficult and more challenging, and also rationing began to kick in at home around products like sugar. Those were the ingredients that were missing that Wrigley was seeking to replace. But I'm actually not sure what they used in place of Chickel, unfortunately. That's a good question. I've got a question from an anonymous attendee. Has there been any effort to connect with the unions that represented workers in the area factories? They have their own history to tell. Maybe the Labour Council. I was a national union rep for the Woods workers beginning in 1973. That's fascinating. Yes, we did make some connections with some of the unions, and we didn't actually get a chance to fully get into it on this tour, but if you go to the Made in Toronto website and take the tour there is additional content around some of the union building, and also the various strikes that affected the area as well. I touched on one of the major strikes that affected Rolf Clark Stone. but also there was a major back and forth labor-wise at the ACME and Jefferson factory as well, and we get into some of that on the digital version of the tour. I'm not seeing any more questions. It's very kind of you all to be so complimentary in the Q&A. I'm seeing Talia here actually says that gum was made from a tree resin, but is now a product of the oil industry, and that tree resin, I believe, is Chickel. That's the stuff that makes it chewy, the sort of rubber-like texture of chewing gum. If there's any more questions, please do put them in the Q&A. But if not, I think we'll wrap it up.
Fabulous. So we'll just stay attuned to that, but I'll make some closing comments while we do. Again, I want to thank you, Chris, for sharing all of this knowledge. Even you had an answer for what they used in the gum ingredients, which I thought maybe would stump you, but I should have more faith in your deep knowledge. So thank you for sharing this with all of us. And I want to thank TD as well for their presenting sponsorship of the tour program this year. If you enjoyed today and you want to check out some of the other tours and events that are happening, there are both virtual and safe in-person variations of the tour programs. You can get more details about all of that by going onto the website and clicking what's on, and you can see what's coming up next. You can also take the opportunity, it's just been dropped again in the chat, to lead yourself through a bit of a Dundas Carlaw area tour with the digital materials. And I would also be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to offer a request. Heritage Toronto is proud to be a donor-driven charity. And over the past year, donor support has really allowed us to continue to serve Toronto by prioritizing our emerging historians opportunities, developing new tours, and expanding our digital programming, much like this virtual presentation today. So if you believe in the importance of engaging with our past and sharing our passion for Toronto, would you please consider going online to the Heritage Toronto website or by mail or phone, the options are on your screen, and making a contribution today. We would really appreciate your support, and it helps us do this amazing work. So without further ado, I don't see any new questions in the chat. So I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Chris, and have a great evening.
Thanks a lot, everybody. And thanks also to Heather Kingdon, who was running the show behind the scenes today with her camera off. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
Take care.